Namaste, dear friends, and a very warm welcome again to this course on Introduction to Indian Psychology. We are nearing the finishing line and we are in the week 11 now. We've been looking at techniques of consciousness followed by the outcomes. What are the manifestations of the different practices that we undertake? This week, we've decided to look at certain case studies of living embodiments of the practices of yoga and what are their lives like, what are their teachings, what was their international and national influence. So here we'd like to start with two great seers, namely Sadashiva Brahmendra Saraswati and Ramana Maharshi. So here's a lecture overview. I'll start with Sadashiva Brahmendra Saraswati and then move on to Sri Ramana Maharshi, and in each case we will try and follow this particular template, which means we'll start with an introduction and a famous story about the personality, followed by the historical context in which they lived, their core teachings, applications of their teachings in Indian psychology, similarities with Western psychology, and an exercise pertaining to that particular individual. I'll do this with the second personality and then we'll end with glossary, references and some food for thought. About him, he was a completely liberated mind. He was born as Shivarama Krishna in about 1630 and he became a towering intellectual in Advaita Vedanta. He renounced worldly life to become an Avadhuta, a mystic who is completely free from societal and egoic norms. He is said to have achieved the state of Jivan Mukta, one who is psychologically liberated while still in the physical body. And another important feature about him was that he was known for his profound silence or mauna, and through that he transcended the need for verbal communication and social validation. There is also a story in his life where it seems he was a very talkative person. So his teacher once asked him, like, when are you going to keep quiet? And he said, now. And they say that from that moment he went into Mauna, which then led to a lot of profound experiences. He attained Jiva Samadhi, or a conscious exit from the body, in around 1756 in Nerur in Tamil Nadu. Famous life story associated with him is that of a severe dam. So the story goes that while wandering in a state of deep Sahajavastha or a deep Samadhi, which is a continuous flow and absorption, Sadashiva Brahmendra Saraswati ji walked entirely naked and oblivious through the harem of a Muslim Nawab who was swimming with his women. Then what happened is that an enraged soldier drew his sword and chopped off Brahmendra's arm. Now, any normal person would have been completely bewildered and in pain, but instead of reacting with trauma and pain or fight or flight response, Sadashiva Brahmendra Saraswati ji kept walking as if nothing had happened. This was a complete eye-opener for the Nawab and his soldiers, who were terrified that they had struck such a highly advanced Avadhuta, and they chased after him with a severe arm. And Sadashiva Brahmendra Saraswati, he just took the arm and put it back. They were all weeping for forgiveness, but the arm was just seamlessly restored as if nothing had happened at all. What was the impact? The impact was such that while the physical restoration is often viewed as a miracle, the psychological impact was the true lesson. It demonstrated the absolute pinnacle of cognitive diffusion, which is that a mind was so profoundly disconnected from the biological ego that even the catastrophic physical trauma did not trigger a sympathetic nervous system panic response. I think this is something that's really worth thinking about. The extent of impacts that one can have through the Brahman consciousness that one can embody, and very, very literally embody, that consciousness was so seamlessly real for him that whether he was in that spirit self or whether there was a biological arm that was severe and joint again, didn't make any difference to that individual. So this was, like I said, a living model of such possibilities that the practice of yoga traditions and different techniques of consciousness can offer an individual. Something about the time and context in which he lived. So he flourished in the 18th century around the Kaveri Delta, which was a hub of cultural and spiritual revival. And it was a period that was marked by political transitions because the Maratha rule was in Tanjavur and early European influence was beginning to take place in those regions. Society required a unifying psychological force to transcend the rigid sectarian and caste boundaries. So these caste boundaries had started happening and they were there, but the British rule also imposed certain laws that only fossilized those rules and those divisions even more within the society itself. So this era saw the renaissance of Carnatic music and utilized a lot of his compositions as a tool for Nada Yoga, which is the yoga of sound. Sadashiva Brahmendra Saraswati ji provided an experiential, highly accessible path to ultimate truth amidst the societal flux. Some of his main teachings, one of it was this radical non-dualism, and we saw that there was no body consciousness difference for him. So he talked of Advaita Vedanta, and the realization was that the individual mind and universal consciousness are a single continuum, eliminating isolation-induced anxiety. He also was a great propounder of Vairagya. This is absolute uncompromising detachment from the neurotic, exhausting demands of the ego. So he says, Manasa Sancharare, this was one of his famous lines where he says, "O mind, wander in Brahman." And this led to the cognitive instruction to redirect an anxious mind towards an elevated, secure deal. We see again, when we talk of the Brahman consciousness, when we talk of the quantum lens, we are then talking about this possibility of living in that consciousness. But for us, it is a mind game. For him, it was a very palpable living experience, and therefore there really was no difference between the body, the mind, consciousness. Everything was nothing but part of that continuum of consciousness itself. So he also spoke of Brahma Drishti, and this was the cognitive shift to seeing the underlying divine reality in every living being and circumstance. What are some of the applications of his teachings in Indian psychology? So he authored the Yoga Sudhakara, which is a brilliant psychological commentary on Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. And I think it would definitely be worth reading, because there is a difference between reading the translations and interpretations of a scholar versus the translations and interpretations of a living yogi who has embodied the different teachings of those particular texts. So he provides advanced therapeutic models for Mano Nigraha, which is absolute regulation and control of the mind. He demonstrates how to dismantle the ahankara, the I maker or the ego construct. And he utilizes kirtana, musical chanting, as a somatic psychological intervention to regulate the nervous system. I mean, he didn't go down all the way to talking about the nervous system, but it was the practice of chanting that would help to relax the individual. He also defines optimum mental health not as a coping with stress, but as transcending the mind that perceives stress. Alright, so really looking at how the mind responds to its circumstances. What are some similarities with Western psychology? So Western psychology has the ideas of acceptance and commitment therapy, and he talks of cognitive diffusion, which is observing thoughts neutrally without identifying with them as the core self. Then there is a concept of the radical acceptance, and he completely talks about accepting physical and situational reality without egoic resistance or secondary suffering. Very interesting ideas again. These layers are very important. He talks of the flow state that Csikszentmihalyi talks about. So it's about Sahajavastha, the state of natural, unbroken and effortless, spontaneous action that rises from being at the heart of the consciousness stuff of Brahman. The transpersonal psychology, so they talk of the empirical drive for self-transcendence beyond standard Maslowian self-actualization. List of important works. So he talks of Atmavidya Vilasa. This is the play of self-knowledge, a poetic masterpiece detailing the first-person phenomenology of living without an ego. He also has the important work of Yoga Sudhakara, which, as we saw, is the nectar of yoga. It's a critical, practical commentary on the mechanisms of Patanjali's cognitive aphorisms or the sutras that he talks about. Then Brahma Tattva Prakashika. This is a detailed exposition clarifying the profound non-dual insights of the Brahman status. Then Carnatic compositions, he has profound psychological interventions, Pibare Rama Rasam, disguised as highly accessible music. Some of the influence that he had at national and international platforms. So at the national level, he was revered as the ultimate benchmark of an Avadhuta within the Indian spiritual and psychological landscapes. We have different degrees of realized souls. So Avadhuta is a very high level of a realized yogi. His musical compositions remain a staple in Carnatic music, which are actively used in modern Nada Yoga therapies. And he also inspired generations of scholars to integrate rigorous intellect with profound emotional surrender, encountering Tayumanavar in 1938. Then there is also the international influence, where his commentary Yoga Sudhakara is studied by global scholars of yoga psychology and philosophy. He serves as a primary case study for transpersonal psychologists, studying the extreme liberated states of human consciousness that are possible. An exercise for you from here. So, based on the psychological principle of his composition, Manasa Sancharare, or mind wanderer, the mind's nature is to wander, and attempting to suppress it forcefully often causes psychological friction. So, let's try this out. So, first step is notice when your mind begins to anxiously ruminate on past regrets or future fears. Okay, so you can sit to do that now, or just take this into stock and do it whenever the time is right for you. Next, deliberately redirect its wanderings. Give a higher calming ideal to wander, a mantra, your breath, or a peaceful visualization, because the senses will in any case go. Now, what are you going to fix your senses on? Are they being slaves of their external circumstances, vritti sarupya, or are you going to be able to contain it and fix them on inner points of anchors which are going to promote our well-being? So, a reflection here, how does this cognitive redirection, rather than forceful suppression, alter your emotional baseline and physical tension? So, once you practice it, you will then have to do this observation of in what ways this particular exercise can benefit you. Sri Ramana Maharshi, he lived between 1870 and 1950. So, a little bit about him. There was a major thing that marked him was his death experience. He was born as Venkataraman Iyer in 1879 in Tamil Nadu. At the age of 16, he underwent a spontaneous, intense psychological confrontation with death. So, what happened is that he held his breath and he said, let me just see how long I can hold his breath. So, instead of panicking, he simulated the death of his physical body to observe what remained, and then suddenly realized that he was observing his consciousness, or Atman, which is completely distinct from the mortal body and the fluctuating mind. So, this experience was a major transition in his life, which permanently shifted his psychological baseline, and he lived as a Jivanamukta, which is liberated while living and radiating profound mauna as well, just like we had with Sadashiva Brahmendra Saraswati, who lived a big part of his life in silence. So, a famous story was a death experience that we've mentioned in brief, but basically at the age of 16, young Venkataramana was suddenly gripped by a visceral, overwhelming psychological terror of his own imminent death. So, instead of fleeing that anxiety and seeking comfort from his family or trying to distract his mind, he simulated a rigor mortis. So, he lay perfectly still and aggressively investigated the phenomenon of dying. So, he forced his awareness to observe what happens when the body dies. So, he discovered that while the physical body ceases and the cognitive brain stops, the fundamental I, or the pure awareness, remains entirely untouched, silent and unbroken. What was the impact of this? So, this single intense session of inward introspective inquiry permanently dissolved his psychological conditioning, and he instantly transformed into a Jivanamukta, liberated while living, forming the exact clinical basis for his famous Vichara method, which was a method of self-enquiry. So, what was the time and context? He lived primarily from 1896 to 1950 at the base of the Arunachalam mountain in Tiruvannamalai. And this was a time of the British colonial rule, where Indian intellectuals were highly focused on defending or systematizing the ancient texts. He propounded Advaita, non-dualism, but this was often reduced to academic semantic debates. What Ramana did was that he provided a stark contrast. He claimed no scholarly authority, yet spoke from the absolute authority of direct experience. And he democratized psychological liberation, making it accessible regardless of caste, education or religious background, which is what it really is. Anyone who has a quantum lens has access to that reality and that world. So it doesn't depend on how educated you are or non-educated you are. What really matters is how consistently one is pursuing the quest of the true self within and the transcendent being, if that is possible. What are some of his main inquiries? The main thing being the path of self-inquiry or vichara. So he talks of self-inquiry and he talks of the relentless internal investigation into the nature and origin of the ego. So who is this I? Who is this I? In everything, to ask the question, who is this I really who is acting things out? Is it the I within the individual? Is it an I which is representative of other things? Or is there an I which is much quieter, much more silent, which just seeks to get the right thing done at the right time? So the I thought, the aham vritti, the realization for him was that ego is not a permanent entity, but merely a persistent thought. So he talked about tracing to the source. So by asking the question, to whom does this thought arise? To constantly redirect awareness back to the observer. So this was also the spurana, which is the subtle, continuous pulsation of pure awareness that remains when the biological ego collapses. Applications in Indian psychology, there is a radical shift in terms of the therapeutic focus from the content of consciousness to the nature of consciousness. So he identifies the aham vritti, the I thought, as the root of all psychopathology. And without the I thought, the secondary thoughts, anxieties, desires, traumas, they have no psychological anchor. He teaches practitioners to observe the mind, the spurana, the subtle pulsation of awareness. And he offers a definitive cure for existential dread by shifting identity from the biological self to universal awareness. And this is the similarity we found with Sadashiva Brahmendra Saraswati ji as well, who had this experience of this definite shift or the move from the identity of the biological self to the awareness of the universal internal reality. Similarities with Western psychology. So we have the phenomenological reduction. Here there is a stripping away of all assumptions and biological graphs to examine the raw nature of consciousness itself. So this continuous asking of who really am I, who really am I, who really am I, who is making choices, who is going there, who. This asking of the who and trying to connect to the real doer or the real instrument is the call of Indian psychology. So self as context, the psychological flexibility was to observe thoughts as passing events within the arena of the true self. So the true self becomes the baseline and within that whatever is taking place. So existential psychotherapy, this is about directly resolving the core existential anxieties of death and meaningless through experiential realization. There is also the understanding of transpersonal integration. So here there is Carl Jung's recognition of shifting from the fragile conscious ego to the infinite, secure, deeper self. So they say that Carl Jung also was interested in Ramana Maharshiji's work and was inspired by them to certain degrees. List of important works. So he wrote this work in Tamil which is very famous, known as Naan Yaru, Who Am I? So this is a foundational Tamil prose text answering the core psychological questions of a seeker, compiled for answers written in sand. Now just one addition here is that, when we talk of Indian psychology, there is often this confusion about it being philosophy alone. Now the challenge for the Indian mind and people who understand Indian culture or Bharatiya civilization realize that there is a very strong backdrop of this kind of a philosophical basis. This ontology is a very broadly shared ontology, and therefore it is very natural to hear some words and then immediately stamp a label on it saying that this is primarily philosophical, spiritual stuff and doesn't have much psychology in it. But then you have to realize that philosophy was never just a kind of an intellectual activity here. It was a darshana. It had to culminate in the seeing of what that particular school of thought is talking about. So that is very important to remember when we are looking at the philosophy, which is the darshana, and we are looking at its application. And Indian psychology is really saying, how do we embody those practices? And that's why we have these examples for you. What's the next one? Upadesha Saram. So this is about the essence of instruction, a brilliant 30-verse synthesis of karma, bhakti, yoga and jnana methodologies. The other one is Ulladu Narpadu, which is 40 verses on reality, a highly rigorous analytical text dissecting the nature of reality, time and the mind. And then finally the Ramana Gita, which is Sanskrit text recorded by his disciple Ganapati Muniji, which details his teachings on the mechanics of consciousness. Influence, national and international. So at a national level, he revitalized the pure path of jnana or knowledge in modern India or Bharata, proving that supreme realization is accessible without complex ritual, because he himself was an illiterate person. But the kind of realizations he had through first person experience was a complete roadmap and a manual for anybody who's interested to find themselves. So he deeply influenced prominent Indian philosophers and psychologists like Dr. S. Radhakrishnan and T.M.P. Mahadevanji, as well as different kinds of psychologists, foreigners as well. We see here that he was introduced to the West by Paul Brunton in his 1934 book, which is A Search in Secret India. This got the attention of global intellectuals like Carl Jung, Somerset Maugham and Ken Wilber, and it also remains a foundational pillar for the modern global mindfulness and Neo-Advaita movements. So let's do the exercise. So here he talks of the practice of vichara or self-inquiry to isolate the I thought. So he recommends that you sit quietly and allow a thought to arise. That thought could be like, I'm stressed about tomorrow, for example. Then he says, ask the cognitive question, to whom does this thought arise? And you will see automatically the mind will jump in and answer, to me, of course. Then he says, deliver the psychological intervention. Who am I? Where does this I come from? And then do not answer the question verbally. Simply observe the mental silence and the sudden lack of psychological anchoring. Finally, he says the reflection is, how intensely are you able to track the observer automatically? And this stops the observed anxieties from proliferating. So the more we can stand back into the Sakshi Bhava and observe without jumping into comments and likes and dislikes, etc. Just observe something as if it was happening to a third person that is taking place. And when you see that, there will be a lot of doors that will be unlocked automatically. So here's a glossary of important terms, references, food for thought. So sleeping because of Maya, illusion, the individual sees thousands of dreams. An exceptional individual is awakened from his sleep by the instruction of his guru and shines in the ocean of bliss. This is by Sadashiva Brahmendra Saraswati in his Atma Vidya Vilasa. The next one by Sri Ramana Maharshi says, the thought, who am I, will destroy all other thoughts, and like the stick used for stirring the burning pyre, it will itself in the end get destroyed. Then there will arise self-realization. Okay, so it's about letting go of the egoic self in its entirety, which can then take us to the next dimension of self-realization and self-fulfillment. So my dear friends, we come to the close of this session, and I hope that you have been able to appreciate the features and the experiences that such great yogis have had. The fact that they actually were able to bring this into their own lives is also an invitation for each one of us to try and implement it and see how we can benefit from them in our own lives and possibly become Jivan Muktas as well. So I'll leave you with these thoughts. Namaste.